Okay, so for this tutorial, I wanted to show people how to work with texture rubbings and how to create texture rubbings. So I think this is something that we're asking people to do for this module. And it's something that is really important, I think, when you're working with digital tools. I want people to have this experience because I think it's something that when people are first working in digital environments and using digital tools, I think that there's this idea that you can't combine something that you made physically with something in the digital space. And so I want to give you all practice with doing that. And so we're going to be using the textured rubbings because it is something that most people can do it. It's a very simple technique, but it also produces a really interesting image, and it also produces a texture, which is something that I think is oftentimes missing when you're looking at digital artwork. So digital artworks, you can do a lot with color, you can do a lot with the photography, you can make a lot of graphics and illustrations. Something about texture and physical texture, I think, is lacking a lot from digital artwork. So I really want people to get that experience. And and this is also something, learning how to do this, you can also then begin to start working with your drawings, bringing your drawings in. When I work in digital environments, I often, a lot of projects, I will combine things like my drawings that I scan or I photograph, sculpture that I scan, or, well, I have to photograph the sculpture, paintings, things that have texture and things that I create in a physical space and doing physical techniques. And then I will bring them into a digital space and apply different processes to them. So I think it really can add a lot to digital artwork. So I really want people to have this practice. So we're going to start with the rubbings. And for this exercise, I believe that we're asking people to work with a organic texture. So something that's from nature or something that is manufactured or made by humans. So to start with, I'm going to use this leaf that I found outside of my studio. And the only things that you need other than your objects are pencils, so transfer instruments, and then your paper. And just a quick couple of ideas for these choices. This is probably more for people who are art majors. You might have a lot of different pencils that you are working with, and I've actually found that the harder the pencil, the better. So if you're using something like charcoal or a really soft pencil like a 6B or a 2B, those are actually so soft of a medium that the transfer doesn't really get through. So it's really hard it's really hard to get the details of whatever it is you're trying to transfer if you're using a softer medium. And waxy mediums are really great too, so things like crayons, but the pencil is probably something that most people have access to. And for those of you that aren't art majors, any kind of pencil that you're using is probably fine, like a number 2 pencil. That's something that will totally work for this project. So same thing with paper. For those of you who are art majors, this is coming out of my sketchbook, and this is probably the heaviest paper that I would suggest using. If you start working with something like canvas or watercolor paper, you'll actually find that while you're creating the rubbing or the transfer, you're going to end up getting more of the texture of the grain of the paper than you are of the object below it. So you want to be working with a relatively thin paper, and if you have something like tracing paper, that's actually ideal for this project. And for the rest of you who maybe don't have tons of different paper lying around your house, you can just use printer paper, that, as long as it's not glossy, because that might make it hard to make a mark on the surface, and copy paper. So just out of the copy machine, really a lighter paper is actually ideal for these. And keep in mind, you're going to be photographing this, so it doesn't really matter what this kind of in-between step looks like. As long as you can create this transfer, it's great. So pretty straightforward. You take the thing that you're transferring, you put it underneath your paper. You want to have a pretty tight, you want to hold the paper kind of tight over that object, and then you bring your pencil down to the side and then start creating that rubbing. And so what will happen is that any of the texture of that object will start to get picked up. So edges, cracks, when you're working with leaves, and a lot of people use leaves for this, you start to get the veins of the leaf, and so that texture starts to transfer. So you're getting an interesting imprint and an indexical imprint of this object, and then you're also transferring that texture onto this two-dimensional piece of paper. So I think this is a really interesting process because you're essentially taking something, the 3D qualities of an object, and then transferring them to a two-dimensional transfer or rubbing, and then for this project you're going to be further transforming this in Photoshop, so within that digital space. So you can see here, have a nice outline of a leaf, and pretty simple, right? Okay, so next I'm going to use this piece of bark, and I want people to, as much as possible, these are just things that I grabbed outside of my studio because I felt like they were going to be good examples of showing this technique. But since you're going to be incorporating these with your self-portraits, I think it's a great opportunity to use something that maybe has some more meaning to you than just being the first thing that you found when you walked outside of your dorm room. I know that there's a lot of different natural materials at your disposal, especially if you're living on campus at UC Santa Cruz. But so because of that, have a little bit of thought, you know, when you're selecting these objects. All right, so this is showing, this has a little bit more definition and a little bit of a heavier texture than the leaf. So you can see here with this rubbing, it's coming up a little bit more. So the last one I want to show is of this medium format camera. And I think that some of the artists I think that I'm showing in lecture actually used cameras as part of the rubbings, and I wanted to show this object because while it's definitely has some flat areas to it, it also has some depth, and so this is definitely a little bit more of a three-dimensional object. So you could do this assignment with like a key or something that's a little bit flatter, but I wanted to show this object because I think it shows how you have some interesting opportunity here when you're working with things that are more three-dimensional. You can start to move your paper to get things like edges, but then you can also start to wrap that paper around and then continue. So right now I'm kind of wrapping this paper around and I'm trying to continue to capture this object, even though it's now I'm kind of going vertical. But what this does is this allows you to create almost an unfolding, or you're transforming this three-dimensional object onto this two-dimensional piece of paper, and then you're going to be further transforming this once you bring it into Photoshop. But I think it's a great way to work with a physical object and to create a really interesting composition that you can then further develop within a digital environment. And you can see that with these manufactured objects, you start getting things that are a little bit more geometric, and you get these nice hard edges. And so the contrast between these objects and the organic objects, that's one of the things I want people to be able to work with. And you can see here that I moved my paper a little bit, so I'm starting to get this overlap, and that's something that's okay. And I think that these are all things that are really interesting and opportunities to experiment with this technique and this medium. So don't feel like it has to be this perfect transfer, especially, and I'm hoping that people can take that to heart while they're working with this, because you're going to be developing these so much in the digital environment that it's not really going to matter, you know, if this isn't a perfect transfer. And there's a lot of editing and different transformations that you can then apply later on. So you start to create this really interesting composition, this almost unfolding of these more three-dimensional objects. And the last thing I want to show here is just how things like certain signage and labels that are on manufactured elements, those can transfer, and then you can get these really great imprints using this process. So that was just going over the little label on the back, but because it was a slight engraved label, it's coming through in that drawing, and that's going to look really interesting when you bring that into Photoshop. So now once you have these completed, I'm going to show you people how to use the levels in Photoshop in order to bring out some of these details a little bit more. Let me hold this up a little bit so you can kind of see so there's definitely ways to further enhance that in Photoshop, and I'm going to show people how to do that within the studio tutorial video. The last thing I want people to remember, when you're taking the photograph and you're using your phone, you don't want this to happen. So I have a light set up right now so that I could film this, and I'm getting a really intense shadow. So that's going to be really hard to work with in Photoshop if you have a shadow like this. So and I know that a lot of you might have overhead lighting where you're doing this. So what I would suggest doing is just taping it up on the wall and just making sure that you're not between the light source and whatever it is you're rubbing that you're photographing. So that way you won't have to deal with shadows. So photograph this and then transfer it into your computer, and then you'll be able to open it in Photoshop, and then the studio tutorial videos will take it from there.